Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiumSpiz22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I'd like to welcome back once again my sidekick in podcasting, Mr. Kale Zelden. Kale, I always like having you on the show, and I like going on your show because we always get such positive feedback from people.
It's
On,
true. They seem to like us, Larry. I don't know.
I
So
don't know. I'm such an unlikable guy. I don't know why anybody would cotton to. I just ran into somebody at church the Sunday,
yeah.
some non-Catholic who came to the ordinary at parish
Mm.
because he hears me talk about it on my podcast, and I
Oh
said,
yeah.
you listen to my stupid podcast?" He goes, "Oh yeah, I
It's
listen
great.
to every word." And I said, "You're not even Catholic." He goes, "Yeah, but I'm about to be." So
Oh
there you
yeah,
go.
that's cool.
So
That's
anyway,
cool.
so this and just quick announcement. Once again, remind people, yes, we did sell the farm.
Oh great.
Closing is probably October 31st. That seems to be the
It
date, which is coming quickly. So I have to find
it
a
is.
mover and pack
Oh
and
yeah.
so I mentioned all this. I do have a bunch of podcasts set up this week, and I might not release them all immediately and
Sure.
space them out because I think there's going to be a 2 or 3 week
Yeah.
hiatus
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
me. If for no other reason, everything's packed away. Anyway, let's get on with it. Kale texted me via private message on Facebook the other day, and he goes, I think we should get together and do a podcast with regard to a hypothetical question that I want you to ask. So, Kale, I'm going to let you pose the
Yep.
question.
Yeah. So a few days ago was the anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council in 1962, and it was all the regular posts on social media just marking the occasion. And it occurred to me that, well, number one, I still, as you and I have talked about before, Larry, I still think that Vatican II is consequential and important. I have been all over the map about it, I must admit, but one of the dogged questions that I have is that, what role does history play, the sort of the surrounding historical moment play in the uh, running of the council, any council,
Yeah.
and the conclusions of a council and how the council sort of goes about its business. And so I wonder, what would it have been like? And I'm kind of leaning heavily on you here, but what would it have been like? Maybe two counterfactuals that Pope Paul VI calls the Second Vatican Council in 1972, or Pope No, it wouldn't have been John the 23rd. Who was the one before? Was it
Pius the 12th.
Pius the 12th? Thank you. Sorry about that. Or what if Pius the 12th had called it in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War? Let's call it 1952, thereabouts. And so I wonder if you've ever kind of had that kind of thought. I mean,
Oh
maybe you
yeah.
can maybe start off with what role do you see history playing in
Yeah.
the hammering out of whatever occurs at a council? And so, what do you think? Would you want to go 72 or 52 first?
I'm going to start with 52, but
Great.
first I'll just make a general statement that says, you and I, though, in general agreement on almost everything, I
Yep.
probably have a more positive enthusiasm for Vatican II
Mhm.
than you do. The folks over at blog posts like Rorate Caeli will they refer to it as the Boomer Council. Well, I'm
Yeah,
a tail end boomer,
you
so
are.
yeah,
Yeah. So
nevertheless,
that's fair. I just wanted real quick. I mean, I think that's fair. I think my appreciation of the council is complicated, and and the one that we're not going to talk about today, right? The 1962 council. I have mixed feelings about it, but not in, I think, the sort of the normal, you know, more traditionalist take on the Second Vatican Council. But I do think that it was. Well, it's a hot potato that still needs to be dealt with. So I think you're right, and maybe
but
as part of this 52-72 conversation, maybe some of this will come out.
Well, the reason why I bring up the Rorage Caeli crowd and people like it referring to it
Mhm.
as the Boomer Council is that they're right. So,
Mhm.
in other words, it pertains to your hypothetical, which is how does the historical period
Yeah.
affect the actual council? And the fact is, all right, This is not the council of boomers in the sense it was boomers that
Right.
did the council,
Staffed,
because
right,
I
exactly.
was only 5 years old for
Yeah.
crying out.
Yeah.
We were the ones who lived in the immediate aftermath of the council, and then when we became adults, were
Mhm.
responsible for implementing. But anyway,
Right.
I want to back up a bit and point out why
Yeah.
your hypothetical is such a great question, for a very strong historical reason, which is remind people that the First Vatican Council
Right.
was
Good.
never
Good.
officially closed. It,
Right.
it, it was convening, and then political events in Italy forced its premature closure. So many, many popes after Vatican I was over had openly contemplated calling a Vatican II in order to complete Vatican I.
Interesting. Yeah.
Pius the 11th considered it. Pius the 12th strongly considered it, and they both said no. It's just not the right time for it. Of course, Pius the 12th spent a good chunk of his papacy
The
dealing with
Second
World
World
War
War.
II
Right.
and the aftermath of that, and so he probably just thought, no, we just can't do this. So, in other words, your hypothetical is not pure speculation. It's something that could have happened. It could have happened, in the
Right.
1920s. It could have happened in the 1940s, late 40s,
Right.
or early 50s. Now, what if it had? What if the council had happened under the pontificate of Pius the
Right.
12th? I think it would have been a very,
Right.
very different council,
Mhm.
because I think Pius the 12th would have envisioned it very strictly as simply the completion of Vatican I. And so
Mhm.
there would have been a few loose ends, especially with regard to, say, the relationship between papal authority and episcopal authority.
Right.
That didn't quite get worked out. And Pius the 12th probably would have done something with that along those lines, and maybe dealt with the issue of the relationship between church and state in the light of, post World War II reconstruction along the lines of liberal democracy in the West
Yeah. Yeah.
gaining
Good.
ascendancy, the conflict with the Soviet Union. There probably would have been very strong condemnations of communism
Mhm.
and the Soviet, because Pius the 12th was such a resolute
Right.
anti-communist.
And
Uh,
and
and,
and, if I could just jump in on this, I think, I've been spending a lot of time reading about the mid-century. I'm teaching a course that kind of is an attempt to tease out what's going on culturally, theologically, philosophically, scientifically, all these various strains, like what's going on in the lead up, what's going on in the mid-century, and I've been kind of taking as my jumping off point two poems, one by William Butler Yeats and the second by T.S. Eliot. That's The Second Coming and The Wasteland. One is written, I think, in 1916 or 17. That's The Second Coming by Yeats. And The Wasteland comes out, I believe, in 21 or 22. And so, you have this moment in World War One, and then, World War One probably creates as many problems as it solves. And the attempt to solve the problem of World War One, in my estimation, in essence, creates the necessary preconditions for the Second World War. And so I think it's important, at least in my way of thinking, or at least I want to kind of put this out here to you, is that, the Vatican, the church, does not exist in a bubble. It does not exist in a vacuum. It certainly existed in the Papal States, but if you are at all familiar with the history of Italy, from, again, roughly the First Council through the Second World War, Italy's not exactly a stable place. And the formation of the nation of Italy, it really comes at the expense of the beleaguered papal states, right? And I think a lot of people miss that part of the pressures that were placed upon the Vatican in the midst of the First Vatican Council, and that doesn't really settle down. I mean, it really isn't until the end of the Second World War and the creation of the post-war consensus that we really even have the kind of safety, calm with which to hold such a council. So I think that it is so vitally important to look at the movements the going on in the church leading up and through the Second World War and all the way into, 1962.
Yeah.
I'm always baffled. Like when you just do, you count, right? You count. It's not a long time between the end of the Second World War and the convening or even the discussions of a Second Vatican Council. And to me, maybe I'm wrong here, Larry, but I think it's impossible to have a sober view of the Second Vatican Council absent a kind of respect uh,
Yes.
for what has just happened.
Absolutely. I'm going to tell a quick story here. I may have told it before to illustrate your point about the Papal States. When I was in seminary in about 1983, I had a canon law teacher, and he was 95 years old.
Mhm.
He
Mhm.
died a few years later. But he told us in canon law class, we were talking about the rules of confession and things, that when he was in the seminary as a young man, in the early 20th
Yeah,
century,
yeah.
he had a canon law teacher, and he was joking, that was even older than I am. He says he was 97. And he goes, his canon law teacher told him a story that he was hearing the first confessions of little kids. And
Right.
one little boy came into the confessional and confessed piracy on papal waters. Now, obviously, the little boy had no idea what the heck he was saying. He had obviously picked up a devotional book, an examination of conscience book, or something along those
Yeah,
lines.
yeah.
And one of the sins listed was piracy on papal waters. And he
Wow,
probably thought that was
that's
cool.
amazing.
And so
Yeah,
he
yeah,
confessed it. The
yeah.
point being, of course, little kids confess all kinds of crazy stuff, and they have
That's
no
so
idea
good.
what it is. But what
It
what
just
really
sounded
struck
cool, though.
me,
It sounded cool.
what really struck me was that, yeah, it wasn't that long ago that the papacy had papal states. And it drives home the fact that one of the things that we have to think about with regard to the Second Vatican Council, even Vatican I,
Yeah,
to a certain extent, is that there's been a shift as well in the role of the Pope in the
right,
church because of the
right,
loss of the papal state. Previous to the loss of the papal states were the last holdout of what we call Christendom.
right,
And the Pope was not so much seen as the oracle on the Tiber
right,
as sort of he is now.
right,
He was seen as simply the leader of Christendom. He was
right.
the spiritual political leader of Christendom. Well, there
Yeah,
was no longer any Christendom, and certainly World War I put the death knell to even
sure.
things like the Habsburgs and
Yeah,
and
the Holy Roman Empire and the Papal States and all that are
the whole
gone
thing.
as a
It's
result of
all
World War One.
gone.
Yeah,
And as
yeah.
a result of that, the Pope now takes on this new role, more spiritual, more
Mhm.
theological,
Mhm.
and not so much sort of the political leader of Christendom. So that is definitely one historical factor with regard to the Second Vatican Council is now Vatican II becomes this hyper theological council because the Vatican had become this hyper theological place rather than
Yeah,
simply a juridical political
right,
place. Anyway, go
right,
ahead.
right. Yeah, and so, I think those of us who grew up after the council, the 1962 council, I think inherited a view, a specific interpretive type of papacy. Right? Like you said, you made the joke about the oracle on the Tiber, and I want to kind of get, not forget that point. In other words, the Pope becomes more than what he was before, insofar as he becomes incredibly symbolic, right?
Yes.
And not only does the Pope become symbolic, but I want to say that on some level, the church becomes symbolic. And I know I'm wading into ecclesiastical
No, go ahead.
rough waters here, but the church stops playing the role of one nation state amongst many and tacks to this kind of this I almost said ultramontanist, but I don't mean it ultramontane. I mean like ultra symbolic as opposed to a kind of in the streets, in the parish, in the
Yeah.
diocese
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
entity. And so in some sense that is only possible, I think, after the destruction of Europe in World War One and especially World War Two. And, if you remember, those of you who are, cinephiles in the audience might remember that, there's a famous Italian film in the post-war called The Bicycle Thief, right? And it was made in 1948, and it's black and white, and it's a beautiful film, but it's filmed in the ruins of Italy, right? And you forget, like the Italian nation state lost the Second World War, right? They were in a, and so the rubble is all around them, and so
Monte
is not.
Cassino had to be rebuilt.
Right, right, right. And so like 1962 kind of rolls around, and it's like we're just not the same thing we were in 1942 or 1932. And not we, just Italy, but the world. And so how much does the Vatican then, after all of those years being a prisoner, what is the famous line? The prisoner of the Vatican, the Pope is
Yeah.
the prisoner of the Vatican. I think that has a way of shaping then what your role is, because if it is true that the leader of the Catholic Church is a prisoner of his own compound, by necessity, you adopt a more symbolic and suasive type
Yeah.
of position rather than a political one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly what has happened to the papacy over the past century, century and a half. And there's, I think, mostly good that has come of that.
Yeah, yeah, I knew you would
I
say that, and so I want to. And that's fine. Up until a few years ago, I probably would have been 100%. Yeah, like that's good. And I'm not prepared to say it's bad.
But there was some bad that came
Yeah,
with
what
it.
are the
So go
costs? I mean,
ahead.
I think maybe that's what we can get into. Like, what are the costs of tacking from a kind of physical, territorial
Well,
reality?
the cost in making the Pope a kind of condensed symbol of all
Yeah,
things Catholic.
yeah,
I know I borrowed that from you. I love that
yeah,
phrase of your
yeah,
condensed symbol.
yeah,
I know you didn't invent it, but you've
yeah. That's
really
fine.
run with
We
it.
talk
But
about it. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, and but the downside to that is that what we lose is the concept that the Pope is yeah, he's at the apex of the church in some sense, but we lose sight of the fact that the entire ecclesial life of the church is simply not reducible to the papacy and what
Mhm.
decisions hinge upon the Pope. Tradition is a thick, richly textured, multi-layered thing, especially liturgically. Okay,
Yeah,
not just doctrinally. The church
yeah,
is also an amalgam of all kinds of popular devotions,
right,
pilgrimages. I
right,
mean, this whole web of
yeah,
Catholic things, and none of them taken by themselves are determinative, but taken as a whole, they create this beautiful matrix called Catholicism. And now, all of a sudden, though, beginning in the 20th century, it's, well, there's a problem in the church. What does the Pope say?
yeah,
Let's let the Pope decide.
yeah,
We're all waiting.
yeah.
Just like I just had an article come out in Pope Leo's new apostolic exhortation to Lexite. And my final conclusion is, well, it's kind of a nothing burger. It doesn't say really anything all that profound, the takeaway from me wasn't so much what the document says, it's the hysteria surrounding it. And the reason why there's hysteria surrounding it is, well, it's the first official magisterial document of the new Pope. Who cares?
Right,
All right,
right, right,
who
right,
gives a fig? All right,
right.
it's a low-level apostolic exhortation, okay, and really not very important in the big picture of things. And yet people are losing their crackers over it because they think that it portends this, it portends that. The Pope is going to take the church in this direction or that. Now, I'm not saying the Pope isn't important, but we need to
I know.
dial this. And
Yeah,
look, I'm guilty. During the John Paul II era, and John Paul
yeah,
remains my great ecclesiastical hero. I don't care what anybody says. Oh, it's CC, oh, blah, blah, blah.
mm,
He's a great Pope and
yeah,
truly a saint. Nevertheless, he is guilty of creating a cult of personality. I don't think he intended it, but
yeah.
I was on board the John Paul
Sure.
II train. I was on board that whole, yes,
Mhm.
Rome. But now I've had to dial it back. And I think many, many Catholics are doing the same. And I think that one of the legacies, let's get back to Vatican II,
Yeah, yeah.
is that had it happened in the 1950s, as you hypothetically ask, I don't think we would have seen the seismic shift in the church uh, that we have seen since it was held.
Agreed. I would agree with that. I think it would have probably been a much more modest endeavor. Uh,
But let me interrupt you
yeah,
there real
yeah,
quick.
yeah,
And my final
yeah.
has to do with the papacy, which is Pius the XII was a strong defender of papal central authority.
Mm.
So I don't think we would have gotten the emphasis on collegiality,
Yeah, yeah. Oh
episcopal.
gosh.
So in other
Yeah. Oh
words, I
yeah.
think we
Yeah.
would have I think we would have seen the cult of the papacy just skyrocket even more.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. I wasn't prepared for you to say that. That's something I have to chew on a little bit. There's that classic image. I believe it was Pius. There's this classic image of him kind of holding his arms up like this. Do you know what I'm talking
Oh
about?
yeah, he that was one of his fame. John Paul was this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but Pius the XII was
Yeah.
this,
Right.
you
And
know.
and 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 Pius the 12th
Oh,
strikes me.
for those listening, we were raising our arms in the air like a referee
Yeah.
scoring a touchdown. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
so Pius seems to be the first pope to play the media game. No shade. I'm not attacking him for this, but I think he's the first pope to exist in a kind of TV world, or at least a media world. We
Yeah.
forget, right, that for all of our blather on about social media, of which I'm guilty because I think it's true, like social media has certainly changed the game. Media changed the game. Print media changed the game. And I mean newspapers, et cetera, et cetera. And then television, film changes the game. And so I I think you might be right that you would have had a more. I mean, because I think Pius played the cult of personality. I think he played that up. I think he used that certainly in his attempts to push back against Hitler, certainly in his attempts to push back against or accommodate, work with Mussolini. So it's not. So you're right. I think that part would probably have been maybe even more solidified. I don't know.
Well, let me steel man that just a little
Yeah,
bit even
yeah.
further. And I don't mean to interrupt you or
No,
dominate the
go, go,
conversation, but I
go.
think this is important. Uh, to get very technical theologically here, one of the things that Vatican II reversed about Pius the XII was it has to do with what are called the three munera or functions of the bishop. And those functions are teaching, governing, sanctifying.
Okay.
All right. Pius the XII taught very explicitly that all three of those munera, all three of those functions come via delegation from the Pope.
Wow. Yeah.
Vatican
Yeah.
II, this is collegiality in Lumen
Hmm.
Gentium,
Hmm.
subtly but directly says, niet, no.
Hmm.
All three of those munera, with some limitation with regard to governance and canon law, but all three of those munera come directly from God by divine right.
Hmm.
So a bishop has by divine right and
Hmm.
not papal delegation. So in other words, then bishops are not simply branch managers of Catholic Inc. with the Pope as the CEO. But that was the model of Pius XII, which is why I say, had Vatican II happened during the reign of Pius XII, we would not have gotten the doctrine of collegiality that we now have. And therefore, we would have seen the cult of the papacy, I think, even stronger had the
Maybe
council.
so. Maybe so. I'm prepared to entertain that.
I said
I,
some pushback coming,
No, no, no,
Kale.
that's okay. But okay, but then, so if a Vatican II happens in 1952, then the Vatican II that we know of does not happen in 1962, 63, and 64, right? And nor so then my question is, if you so that's interesting, right? That means none of the documents of the Second Vatican Council as we know them. So what what would have happened to those issues that were being addressed through the various documents of the Second Vatican Council? How might they have played out if, in other words, if the Second Vatican Council had been convened in 1952, it likely would have been a year, right? And it would have been about what, Larry?
What would the council have been about? It
Right.
would
In
have
other words,
It would have
Yeah,
been about papal authority, completing Vatican I's work on papal jurisdiction and infallibility and those sorts of things. It would have completed that. It probably would have been about church-state relations to a certain
hmm,
extent, in order to for the church to come get a better grip on the fact that Christendom is indeed dead,
right,
integralisms are going away.
right,
How does the
right.
church now negotiate its relationship with modern liberal democracies?
Hmm.
I think that would have been in there. I think actually too there would have been some liturgical stuff because Pius XII had already started tinkering
Yeah,
with the liturgy. He did believe in certain elements of the liturgical movement, and I think there would have been a push. Now, I think, however, that what would have come out of the council in that regard, had it been run by Pius, was simply would have been a tweaking of the old Latin Mass, a
yeah.
tweaking.
That's kind of what I want to steer into a little bit, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
you
Well,
know, the
this is
big,
huge. This is in
yeah.
most average Catholics' minds. That's what the council did.
Right. And we've talked about this, right? In the average council's mind, Vatican II is largely actually kind of ignored, not out of any sense of malice, but the nitty-gritty theological concerns of the council were not where the people and the church meet. Where the people and the church meet is through the work of the people, i.e., liturgy. And I wonder if the tweaking had occurred. In other words, somebody like Bunini had not gotten himself in control of the of the strings. You know, what what would have happened then to the church liturgically if those changes had been made in 1952, as opposed to 19, or even let's say 1958, right? If we're going to keep our years, instead of, that the liturgical changes would have occurred at 58, not 68.
Yeah.
The Novus Ordo, whatever that would have been, would have started in 1960, not 1970. And so therefore, how would a non-liturgically upended Catholic Church have responded to the revolutions, sexual and otherwise?
Well,
Right? Because right,
yeah.
because you and I have talked about those kind of cross
That.
pressures that
Oh my
happen.
goodness, this is such a great hypothetical, Kale, and I
Yeah,
have a hypothetical too. I want
yeah,
to shoot back, but anyway, because liturgy is the Eucharistic liturgy in particular is the life, the source and summit of our whole spiritual life is Vatican II. It's so, as my friend Rodney House says, so dadgum important.
right.
And the fact is, we don't know what would have happened had the
Right.
liturgy not been altered so drastically. But the fact is this, though. There is a somewhat of a control in this experiment outside of the
Okay.
Catholic Church, which
Okay.
is if you look at orthodoxy, for
Mhm.
example, in the United States, let's just begin there. Orthodoxy has not become, it was not, and they haven't changed their liturgy.
Yeah. No, no,
All
no,
right.
no, no.
They were not immune to the fractious revolution of the 60s either. They have hemorrhaged members. They have
Oh yeah,
had their internal scandals and problems as well.
for sure.
And Protestantism certainly, has it went off the
Well,
deep end.
I mean, sad, but the sort of built into the cake is
So,
fracture,
yeah.
right?
So I think that had the liturgy not been changed drastically, I think that I'll give it this. I think that the revolution would have been the bad revolution that
Yeah,
came would have been dampened. It
yeah,
would have been softened. It would not
right.
have been as harsh. But I resolutely believe that the church was going to face a cultural crisis, as did every institution in the Western world, because of
Sure.
the revolution of the 1960s.
The cultural revolutions.
Yeah, I don't think it was going to be immune from those things.
Mhm,
So, for example, my dear old mentor, Dr. Germain Grisey, the moral theologian that I studied under at Mount St. Mary's, I
mhm,
once asked him, and he was, a very orthodox moral theologian, supported
mhm.
Humanae Vitae. I once asked him why, after the end of the Second Vatican Council, did there immediately appear overnight an absolute explosion of new theology books that were dissenting,
Yeah,
putting them on. And he goes, it's very, very simple. Repression Holy Office style,
Mm.
index of book style, doesn't work.
Right.
What had happened is all of these seminary professors and university professors had written books. They just hadn't published them.
Ah,
And they were
right.
squirreled away in their desks, and but they did disseminate them to their students, to
Interesting.
colleagues. They
Yeah, of
were
course.
making the rounds. All right. So when the council lifted the lid off of all of that and said, we're not going to do an index of books anymore, so boom, all of
Yeah.
these guys hit the publication circuits. And so you get this massive. So my point being, it was only a matter of time before the cracks in the edifice that weeds would begin to grow through the cracks in the sidewalk
Hmm.
because of the cultural revolution of this thing. There was no way in the age of mass media and so forth that brewing discontent amongst dissident theologians was simply going to be put down. It was going to happen.
That's really good. That's really helpful, Larry. I think that those of us who are more traditionally minded, at least in my conversations, tend to forget they tend to forget the before times and focus on the excesses of the after times.
Yeah.
And it's very neat to forget things like the index of forbidden books. It's very neat to forget the kind of intellectual repression, and it was not just for theologians. Um,
Oh, yeah.
you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but uh, was it not a confession worthy activity to read a book that was not on that was on the
Oh,
list on the index?
absolutely. Not only books, but to watch movies that
Right,
the church had condemned
right.
and so forth. And it was a very restrictive environment, man. No less a light than one of my theological heroes, Henry de Lubac, who was later
Hmm.
made a cardinal by John Paul.
Hmm.
I mean, he was silenced in the
Hmm.
1950s by the Jesuits, but under pressure from
Interesting.
Pius XII. And his writings were obliquely, not explicitly, but obliquely condemned in Humanae Generis, the encyclical of Pius XII.
Mhm.
So there was this repressive environment. Now, there was a good side to that repressive environment. It did kind of, as Joseph Ratzinger pointed out, the fact of the matter is the church simply wasn't intellectually equipped to deal with the
Right,
modernist crisis. All
right,
right. And so the
right.
church's way of dealing with the modernist crisis was syllabus of errors, index of books. Let's just all stop talking for a while.
Hmm.
And that may not have been an altogether, I'm not here to condemn it. I don't want to be anachronistic.
Yeah.
Popes and the church made decisions for what they thought were sound pastoral reasons. We have to protect the people from theological error. And I think there's some truth. And after the
Mm.
council, when the index of books was lifted, that was a good thing, I think, but there was a downside to it, which is now the burden of responsibility this falls on the bishops as teachers
Right.
to point out to the faithful, this is a bad book, this is a good book, this is a heretical book, this is an
Yeah.
orthodox book.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and they should have been doing that, and
Yeah.
they weren't.
Right. And what's interesting to me is that, to sort of use muscles as an analogy here, that if you are accustomed to using certain muscles, there's a, you know, they grow stronger, you're able to control those muscle movements, but if you don't use these movements, the muscles atrophy. And culturally speaking, maybe part of the exuberant excesses of the revolution were an indirect result of the establishment not having exercised the necessary muscles with which to deal with the crisis of modernism. And it's important, I think, at least for me, to remember that the crisis of modernism means one thing in theological terms, but we have to recognize that modernity,
Yeah.
whatever it is that was birthed, in the aftermath or through the French Revolution, was not a problem that was going to go away, and nor was it a problem that could just be kind of ignored out of existence.
Oh
and the
boy,
cross
go ahead.
pressures of secularity on the laity, not least, and of course the religious and secular priests and whatnot as well. I think it's an under indexed problem.
Very much so. I mean, Joseph Ratzinger characterized Vatican II in its entirety, really in its ethos. But its
Yeah,
mystique was
yeah,
that it was finally the church trying to deal with the French Revolution and its
right,
aftermath. It
right,
really those cross currents of
yeah,
secularity as you talk about. But speaking of the French Revolution, of course, the revolution happens, and it so happens with revolutions. There's the big purge, and
hmm,
the guillotine and all that. So
hmm,
we didn't get that. We didn't get the guillotine, but I always referred to post Vatican II in Seinfeld terms as our Festivus moment with its
yeah,
airing of grievances,
yeah.
the airing of
Well,
grievances, because this is why the bishops didn't do what I think they should have, which is be better teachers, because they were engaged in a big purge. They were
yeah,
flushing the system of what they thought were the anti-revolutionary, counter-revolutionary elements.
right. So I'd like to posit here then, if we can kind of go in this mode of Festivus and the airing of grievances. I love
Yes,
that. I'm a big Seinfeld fan, grew up with it.
me too.
Um, but what I see happening now is a very similar pattern of repression, but it's the polarities are flipped, right? And so I
Yes.
see, again, I'm gonna steel man, sort of a more traditionalist point of view here. I see a bunch of aging churchmen and women who were children of the revolution, not the ones who made the Second Vatican Council, but like you said, those that grew up in it and feel themselves, I should correct myself, feel themselves responsible for the council, both its spirit and perhaps otherwise. They see movements that they characterize as retrograde and uptight and all
Indiatrist.
indie right? And I think they're playing a very similar playbook that the pre-Vatican Council generations played against the liturgical movement and against theological modernism and all this sort of stuff. And I wonder if they see themselves still as the kids of the revolution, but really they need to understand themselves as the kind of desiccated, tired guardians of a council that, in many respects, does not speak to generations, to Gen Z.
Well, actually, other than the liturgical reform, which many Catholics embraced,
Yeah.
and other than certain changes like meatless Fridays went
Yeah. Yeah.
away,
Yeah.
the fact of the matter is, I don't think the council was ever really all that warm and fuzzy for most Catholics because it's so densely theological.
Yeah.
Ratzinger,
So,
I hate to keep
yeah.
quoting Ratzinger.
No, you're right. You're
Ratzinger
right.
says the problem with the council, he says, is that it was a council of theologians, by theologians,
Yeah.
and for the. And he goes, we
Right.
were so obsessed with getting the theology right that
Mhm.
we didn't pay enough attention to the downstream pastoral effects that all of this
Right.
might be
Right.
eventually leading to. The theology is great,
Yeah.
but what was the
And
pastoral effect of it all? How was it
yeah.
going to be received?
Yeah, yeah, and I should have clarified that Vatican II, right? In scare quotes, like because we've spent plenty of time on the mics here talking about in episodes past talking about the difference between the council as it happened in Rome versus the council as it plays out in the media and all those kinds of things, right? And I'm kind of using it in its totality as this, well, I've called it before, a kind of hyper object, right? And so
Yeah.
clearly to me, if I look back on the decade or so of Francis's papacy, and if I look at what I see or sense or feel or smell of the vibe of Leo's baby papacy, I really get the sense that they are tired of younger Johnny come latelys who are trying to keep them from finishing the council.
Yeah.
That phrase, Larry, you and I,
Yeah.
that is a that is a buzzword in our ears because that's exactly the way in my estimation, the sort of the heretics that I grew up in, it taught me or and built the church that I grew up in, very much were upset about Vatican II, not because it was
Oh, yeah.
revolutionary, but because it was not revolutionary enough. And so I just, correct me if I'm wrong, but I really see men of a certain generation unable to admit that, I'm just going to say it, unable to admit that they're losing.
Yeah. And that the council as a pastoral project was in many ways a failure.
Right,
Uh,
right.
the fact is, I'm a Vatican II enthusiast in terms of its theology,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I'm a theologian. But I'd
right.
be the first person to say that as a pastoral project, it was an
Mhm.
unmitigated train wreck.
Right,
It simply by it's a pastoral project, but we're the pastoral fruits. Well,
right,
we saw what the pastoral fruits
right,
were.
right.
Okay, and that's because, and I love your term, hyper object. Immediately after the council, nobody gave a damn what the documents actually taught, what
Right.
the
It's like
theology
whatever,
actually
like
was.
whatever. Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah,
mean, and
totally.
Benedict pointed this out at the Council of the Media. In other words, it
Yeah,
just became so everybody then fell into ecclesiastical political balkanized camps based on your response to this hyper object. Even uh, I never, all through my seminary years, I was in
hmm
seminary 8 years. I didn't read the documents of Vatican II.
hmm
Not once. Here
hmm
and there, but not once. I didn't read the entirety of the conciliar documents until I was doing PhD work. All
Wow.
right. And I think that is true of the vast, vast, vast majority of Catholics of that era. So you're right. The documents, in some sense, are meaningless. What became it
Yeah, yeah,
pastorally,
yeah.
what was important was the council as this hyper object. So now, Pope Francis, Pope Leo, all this, they're trying to, in a sense, resurrect one view of that
View of
hyper
it. Yeah.
object. All right.
Right.
One mystique of the council as this ongoing deconstruction of the last remnants of Baroque scholastic Catholicism,
Yeah.
this ongoing revolution of
Mhm.
turning the church I don't know, into a big fellowship meal. I don't know. I'm not saying that's Pope. I like Pope Leo.
Yeah.
I'm not here to, and I
Yeah,
don't think that.
I don't know
But
what I think of
you know
Leo.
what I'm
I
kind
don't
of.
know what I think. I don't know what I think of Leo
Well,
yet.
I don't think
I'm
anybody knows what they think
yeah.
of Leo yet.
I just look, I got family in Chicago. It's like, you know, I don't know. I, what I said in, the weeks after Leo's elevation is that I like the fact that he seems to like the fact that he's a priest. Like that's cool. I really do like that. And I do get that from him. I genuinely do. Um, but man, he's just of a certain generation in almost every way that I think he's going to be a company man. That was the phrase that I used. I think you and I chatted about this some months ago. I think he's going to be a company man, and it appears that the mission statement of the company is that any kind of pre-conciliar piety or expression in or outside of the liturgy is automatically suspect and a sign of impiety, ironically enough. And the things you see in Charlotte, the things you see in
Detroit.
Detroit, the thing you're seeing now in Knoxville, I don't know what to say about that because I haven't read anything about it. I just saw it flash on the Catholic Nerd websites that I read. You know, it it looks nasty the way that a repressive regime operates. I really think that. And,
Well,
you know,
yeah. It
eh,
was. We'll
go
see
ahead.
what Leo's going to do. Pope Francis, I like to famous. People criticize me for it.
Yeah.
He ran a capo regime,
Yeah.
and thugs, ecclesiastical dung beetle thugs like Cardinal Supich
Right.
were his made men, breaking the knees off of people who didn't step in line, because they weren't revolutionary enough.
Right.
They were counter revolutionaries and so forth. So the question now look, I think so far Pope Leo is just trying to be a conciliator. He's not trying to say anything controversial, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
But he's
Right.
only 70 years old. He could be Pope for another 20 years for crying out loud.
Yeah,
And
easily.
and the fact is, events are going to force him
Interesting.
eventually to come out of his safe little enclave and make decisions that matter. And coming up, Chicago, New York City, you know darn well that he's going to take a very keen interest as an American, as a Chicagoan, in
Yeah.
who he appoints in both of those places. That is going to tell us a lot. That's what I mean by here's an event that's going to force itself
Yeah.
upon Leo, and we're going to see what he's all about in very, very important ways. Uh,
So tell me this, Larry. I agree with all that. I think those are going to be big tells, and I'm sure you and I will fire up the webcams and chew on that when it happens. What if John the 23rd dies in 1960, and for whatever reason, Paul the Sixth, who was gonna be Pope, we all, he was gonna be the
oh
next
yeah,
guy, right?
he was going to be the next pope.
What if
Yes.
he was not able to sort of muster the troops together, until 1970? What what do you think would have happened if instead of 62, we would have had a 72 council, let's say?
I think it would have been catastrophic. Uh,
Why?
well,
My
it
gut, my
maybe,
gut
maybe,
agrees. My gut agrees. I just like,
or it may have simply ended as one of these classic documents put out by a committee filled with people that don't agree with one another. So you get all of these anodyne conciliatory comments, this, and then on the other hand, that. And so it may ended up being a completely inconsequential council,
Hmm.
simply because I think at that point, by 1972, it would have been a situation where, no, you're not going to get, even on, very controversial documents from Vatican II, like Gaudium et Spes and Dignitatis Humanae. You only
Right.
had a small smattering of bishops who said, no, I vote against. Even Lefebvre voted
Right.
in favor of Dignitatis
Right.
Humanae on religious.
Right.
Even he later regretted that. But
Yeah.
so my point is, by 72, I don't think you get that kind of consensus. All right. And I've been
Interesting.
critical in many ways of the
Interesting.
pre-Vatican II church as not the great, simply because I want to demystify it and point out it had faults and failings. But the fact of the matter is this: the church had the internal theological and ecclesiastical resources to pull off Vatican II. Where did it get those resources? From men who were formed in the preconciliar church.
Mhm.
All right. And by the
True.
time you get to 72, most of those men would no longer have been in positions of influence. And I think
Interesting.
you would have gotten either a, a very dangerous council introducing all kinds of strange pastoral, not dogmatic, but pastoral innovations, even worse than what we saw. And the flip side, to go back to your original
Yeah.
hypothetical, I know you got to
Yeah.
run soon.
No, we're good.
Uh,
Yeah, go ahead.
what if Pope, it happened in 1952?
Yeah.
One
Uh-huh.
thing is, I mentioned de Lubac earlier, and he had his famous dispute with Gary Lagrange and the Dominicans
Right.
over it's an
Right.
arcane dispute on the nature of relationship of nature and grace. All
Right.
right,
Right.
so
Right.
Humane Generis comes out and essentially sides with Lagrange against de Lubac. Well, if a council had been held in the 50s, then the Lubacian wing of the church, the Ressourcement theologians would have been, they would not have had a voice. What would have won? It would have been a
Wow.
Lagrangian council. It would have been a neo-scholastic
So in
council.
other
Now,
words, it would have been
some
the
would say,
council. It
some would
would,
say, whoo, that had been great.
yeah,
But
it would have been the council that got scrapped, in the first few weeks of the first session, in other words.
yeah.
Right. Didn't they have all these study groups that they had kind of set up in
Oh,
place? The
yeah.
Holy Office had kind of
The Holy
had
Office would have written
pre-baked
all
the
the,
cake, so to speak. Yeah.
yeah, just like in 1962, the Holy Office
Right.
presented the council with all these pre-made schemata. All
Hmm.
right. And thanks to people like Cardinal Frings and Peritus Joseph Ratzinger, the bishops were swayed to say, no, we're not going to simply rubber stamp crap that was written by the Holy Office. This is going to be different. Now, that may have been smart or not smart, but the
Yeah.
fact is that would not have happened in the 50s. Pius
Right.
XII would have. See, the thing is different. Once again, different.
Yeah.
Paul VI wanted conciliation. He wanted there to be consensus. And so he let all the voices speak, and then he would send the questions back to the Theological Commission run by people like Monsignor Gerard Phillips and so forth to hammer out the compromises and so forth.
So,
Pius XII would not have done that. He would have said, these are the documents, vote
okay.
on them, vote yes, they're pre-marked for your
Okay,
convenience.
so then maybe that's what maybe this is the piece that I'm looking for then, Larry, as I pose these hypotheticals. What is it about conciliation? What is that spirit? Why was Paul the sixth so animated by that peculiar and specific charism?
I think because, and we don't have a historical memory of this ourselves, we didn't live through it, but
That's kind of why
I
I want
don't
to,
think that we can, because I did know priests in my younger years who lived through that era, theologians. He said you can't underestimate the level of acrimony and bitterness that existed in the various theological camps before the council. I
mm,
just alluded to. I mean, the bitter dispute between the French Dominicans and the French Jesuits over the question of nature and grace. The bitter disputes over integralism versus, like Gary Lagrange was down in Vichy, France, supporting the Vichy Marshal Pétain government because he saw it not that he was pro-Nazi, but he
right,
saw it as we got rid of the secular republic.
right,
Maybe we can
right,
restore the monarchy.
right,
So he was
right.
a restoration, and so he was Action Française. That's what that was. De Lubac was a Catholic Action, which was no, no, no,
Interesting.
no, 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 no. We don't want to
Interesting.
go integralist. We're going to change the culture one brick at a time from below on up by building these countercultural witnesses and so forth. That was a huge and
It's
bitter
massive.
debate. All right.
Yeah.
And Paul the Sixth lived through it, and he saw the need for those factions to unite the tribes. In other words, Paul the Sixth understood that secularism was corroding the church. We need to unite the tribes and agree with one another. All right. We're not going to address the issues raised by the French Revolution and modern secularity by arguing over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. All right.
Mm.
We need to figure out theologically how we can reconcile these various theological camps in the church. Anyway, I'm sorry. I
No, no. So okay, no, that's fine. So within, is it fair to say, and again, I'm asking the question, I'm not making a statement. Is it fair to say that in essence, Paul the Sixth saw the future of the church to be essentially cozy with capital L liberalism?
yes.
Is conciliation church speak for liberalism?
I think to a certain extent it was. It's hard to
And I don't mean in
tell.
like the liberal and conservative, like
Well,
Democrats, Republicans. I mean liberalism in that broad sense that we are
oh
talking
yeah,
about
the
now.
political liberalism, born in the
What?
19th century, 18th
Right,
century. Now,
right.
so it's hard to obviously Paul the Sixth was a follower of the integral humanism of someone like a Jacques Maritain. And
Of
so
course.
he did believe that Thomism and modern liberal democracy, let's put it that way, could be reconciled,
Okay.
could find a fit and a home with one another. Also, you alluded earlier to the fractiousness of Italian politics. Paul the Sixth was an Italian. All right, and he developed close friendships with various political Italian figures in order to forge a kind of realpolitik with how the church would interact with Italian politics. He was good friends. This was a devastating thing. Uh, People forget how influential Marxism was in
I
Italy.
was just going to say, keep going. Yeah, I was just going there.
And there was a famous Italian politician that Paul the Sixth was very, very, very close to, Aldo Moro, who was abducted by Italian Marxist guerrilla groups, and he was murdered. And I think they discovered his body in the trunk of a car or something. I mean, Paul the Sixth was openly crushed
Well,
by this event.
right.
And
And people forget. I'm glad you brought this up, Larry. People think that in the lead up, of course, the Italian fascism under Mussolini, leading up to and through the Second World War, you know, there are some very dubious American interventions which kept Italy from being a communist nation, like for
oh yeah,
real,
oh yeah.
and democratically communist nation. And it's you know it's worth remembering that
Well, it's dude, see, there are good things about integralism. There's a downside with regard to Catholic confessional states, which is when they fall apart, it breeds overreaction. And so a
Yeah.
lot of the popularity of Marxism, political Marxism in places like France and in Italy and so forth, especially France and Italy, it was anti-clerical. It was
Right.
giving the
Right.
middle finger to the
Right.
church more
Right.
than it's not.
Right.
Italians, the average Italian wasn't a theoretical Marxist. They hadn't
Right.
read Das Kapital. What
Right.
they knew was that the Marxists were going to give them free health care and they didn't like the church.
Right.
and,
Right.
and so,
Right.
and so, yeah, I'm going to vote for, those guys.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So look, the council happened in 1962. Right. And our fun with counterfactuals aside, you know, the church did what it did between 1962 and 1965. And then it waits a few years and it did what it did with, the Mass of Pope Paul VI. Is there any way, is there any kind of reform of the reform that is possible that will not, sorry, that will be able to put to bed the painful idiom of the 1970s? Is
Yeah.
is there any way to do that?
Yeah,
And
there
is
is.
anybody in the Vatican interested in that?
No. Which
God,
is
see,
why
that's
that's the thing. I'm a huge. I mean, I go to an Anglican ordinary at
yeah,
liturgy. Why
yeah.
is that? Because I actually believe in Mass in the vernacular, prayers prayed out loud. Those so
Mhm.
I believe in the liturgical reform. On the other hand, I believe that the reform was botched, and the ordinariate liturgy seems to me to combine the best
Mhm.
of both liturgy, elevated language, bells and
Mhm.
smells, mass ad
Mhm.
orientem, communion at an altar rail while kneeling, trained choir, chant,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. And I think that it would go a long ways if we had a liturgy like that as the dominant liturgy of the church towards quelling a lot of the
But it
wounds.
won't. It
It,
won't, right, Larry? It won't because
no,
the branch managers that are in charge seem to be wholly interested in trying to quash out anything that they see as a remnant or a holdover of the before times. And
yeah.
I don't know what to say about that, Larry. I don't
Well,
know what to say about that.
I think that we have blind shepherds, at least with regard to liturgy, with due reference, caveat that maybe we don't have the full global perspective. We
Yeah,
live in the secularized West. I
yeah,
don't live in Africa. Maybe in
right.
Africa that my friend Peter Kwasniewski would disagree. He thinks the
Mhm.
TLM is going strong or would have gone strong in Africa.
Mhm.
Kwasniewski points out, it's interesting. Lefebvre was a missionary in
No, I
Africa.
know. Spent most of his time in Africa, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, and quite frankly, a lot of the explosive growth of Catholicism in Africa happened when we still had the old mass. It
Yeah.
didn't,
Yeah.
and so we tend to think, well, the growth happened because of the Novus Ordo. It probably
No.
did. It probably didn't. But
Yeah.
anyway, all of these are. I think we need a synod on the liturgy. I think I think we need people to come together and talk about this at the very least. But I don't think it's going to happen. I think what we have to do, Kale, is I think we just have to wait it out. What's going to happen, at least in the West, as we see in accelerated ways, the church is going to
Shrink,
shrink
shrink so
and
fast,
shrink
so
and
fast.
shrink and
Yeah.
shrink.
Yeah.
Okay. And
That's right.
it's just the church's hand is at some point going to be forced to say we need to, and they're not going to say, oh, this is all caused by bad liturgy. What they're going to say is eventually we're going to get a pope or somebody's going to say, damn, something ain't right.
Yeah.
We're in a tight spot here.
Right.
we we need to
Yeah.
do something.
Right. No, no. I think that, you know, again, to give my traditional friends their due, I think a lot of their instincts in this regard are sound in this way that if the church is to mean anything, it has to become much more vertical in its orientation
Yes.
than the church that you and I grew up in.
Hey, look. Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah. Go
and
ahead. I'm sorry.
at least no, it's okay. And at least their intuition is that it is a tapping back into a sense of vertical mystery, is the sort of the jet fuel of the church. And it's so frustrating for people who are certainly younger than me, and you, that it feels like their fathers hate them
That's
for
true.
that.
I mean, I love that, Kale. That is so true about the need to recon. We've talked about this
Yeah.
before, and we
Yeah.
should do another podcast on about the need for
Yeah.
re-enchantment.
Right.
The fact is, the experiment of trying to convince people that at Mass, Jesus just magically coagulates on the plate out of the
Right.
sheer force of
Right.
our common love for one
Right.
another,
Right.
is just sheer BS.
That's right.
Transubstantiation happens because it's consecrated by a
Yeah.
priest,
That's right.
and that's
That's
the
right.
vertical element. You've heard about Clovis Boff, right? The brother of Leonardo Boff. Okay, Leonardo Boff was one of the famous liberation theologians,
Okay.
okay, in Brazil, one of the most famous. Well,
Mhm.
his brother, elderly too now, recently wrote a new book condemning liberation theology on the
Wow.
following grounds. He points out the church in Latin America within maybe 20 years is going to be Protestant. I mean, Latin America is going to be a Protestant continent,
Yeah.
largely Pentecostal.
Right.
Okay, to the extent that it's not maybe secular as well.
Right.
Catholicism is dying out in many, many ways. Why? He says because for the past 50 years, because of liberation theology in Latin America, we've been emphasizing the horizontal, the horizontal, the
Yeah.
horizontal, horizontal. The concept of a vertical, transcendent, immediate relationship with the supernatural, with something like that, is so important in Latin. Remember, like in Africa,
Yeah.
strong animistic
Yeah.
traditions
Yeah. That's right.
still
That's right.
exist in those places.
Right.
Pentecostalism fits neatly
Yeah.
into that old, and only
Well,
now you're not
because they're not shy of the supernatural. They're not.
no,
Right.
no.
You
You're going to
know,
get gifts of the Holy Spirit
so
if you come here.
so on that front, then one of the reasons why I'm not sanguine about Leo, not anti, just to be clear, but one of the things
Yeah.
the reasons why I'm not sanguine is that, I mean, he's part of that Latin American church. And if you can go do the Latin American church thing and still like kind of give lip service to kind of at least liberation theology adjacent patois, like then to me that just bespeaks of someone who does not get it. I could be wrong. I
Well,
could
he
be wrong,
does
of
quote
course.
the in the Dilexite, he quotes the Arecibo document and so forth. We have to remember too that most of that text was written by Pope Francis, so
Right.
it
Yeah.
could
Right.
be.
Right.
But Pope Leo could have deleted that part too. I'm sure he
Yeah.
deleted parts of it and added some of his own. He could have deleted that part. So I think you're right. And I used to live in Latin America. I didn't live in
Uh,
on the con. I lived in the Dominican Republic for a while.
Got it.
But there were currents of liberation theology there as well. And I just
I
it
mean,
did
to me, put my cards
did
on the table. Nothing is more inimical to the supernatural or the future of the church than liberation theology. Just period, full stop.
yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, I remember when I lived in the Dominican Republic, the Catholics I knew, they'd go to mass. And the family I lived with, they'd come home from mass and then they'd go and say prayers to these various
Yeah,
animistic
yeah,
deities and so
yeah,
forth. They were
yeah,
covering all their bases, but
yeah,
the point is they believed in the eudaimonic realm.
yeah, yeah,
They also
yeah,
believed in simply the demonic realm, and so they had a strong belief in warding off bad spirits
yeah,
and so forth. But
yeah.
but notice they had to get that through popular devotions at home. They weren't
Mm.
getting it. They weren't getting it at church.
Right, right, right. That's right. That's right. All
So
right, well, my
anyway,
friend, I appreciate you having me on to do this what if. I still think there's some meat on this bone that we can pick, but I think I still think that the Second Vatican Council hyperobject has to be contended with, and I don't see much by way of the leadership with any kind of willingness to have a real conversation about it. And
Yeah.
I get really upset the way that I get upset with communists when they say something along the lines of real communism hasn't been tried. I get upset with my church fathers, the people who run my church who
Yeah.
say real Vatican IIism hasn't been tried yet. And I got to tell you, it clangs on the
No,
ears, man.
that's ridiculous. And
Yeah,
not to extend this conversation too
yeah,
long, but one of my hopes for Pope Leo, I don't, he's not going to do it. But what, with regard to Vatican II, hyper object conservation,
yeah,
here's what he should do. If he's so worried about conciliating polarizations, he should simply come out and say, look, we reached the high point with regard to the hermeneutics of retrieval of the council in the papacies of JP2 and Benedict.
right.
JP2 in 1985 held an extraordinary synod on Vatican II and its proper reception.
Hmm.
We're going to simply go with that. Okay.
Right.
That's the reception of Vatican
Yeah,
II. That's it. End of conversation. All right. Done. Now let's move on
yeah,
to the next issue
yeah, yeah.
that we need to deal with.
Yeah,
Okay. Whatever that might be.
that would be both prudent and helpful. You
Yeah.
know?
Instead of this endless scraping off of the
Yeah,
scab
right, right,
over and over and over
right.
again. It's
Well,
like Sisyphus to
that's a
mix
gr
metaphors
no,
now.
I love it though, but it's both, right? I think that's great. It comes very much alive when you say it like that, Larry.
It's time to put it to bed and
Yeah,
move on.
yeah.
Anyway, thanks, Kale. Next time we'll do this on your podcast.
Sounds good. I will promote this on my stuff, and as always, it's a pleasure, Larry. I cannot tell you how happy I am that you guys are closing on the farm. You're
Oh
moving back
yeah,
in town. I just think that's going to be great for
and
you and for your wife
yeah,
and
and it
for your
will.
ministry. So I'm excited.
Well, and I hope I don't step on any toes or say something out of turn here, but I want to say to all of the listeners and viewers, please say a prayer
Yeah.
for Kale's high school because they lost a
Thank you.
student yesterday in tragic circumstances.
Yeah.
I'll just say that,
Appreciate that. Thank you, Larry.
and
Appreciate that.
traumatic. So please pray for his soul. It was a he,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
It
yeah.
was. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you so much,
okay.
Larry.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for listening. Bye
God
now.
bless.